Professor Ivar Lodemel, who is a social policy expert presently associated with the Oslo University College in Norway. He is speaking to the MPP candidates at National Law School of India University, and he's introducing the key concepts of welfare and social policy. He's written renowned works like The Welfare Paradox and An Offer You Cannot Refuse. So thank you for joining us, sir, for this interview for our blog. You can ask the first question.
Okay, so starting with the welfare classifications. So conventionally, there are three ways of organizing welfare as we've studied. So Titmus's three models. The first model talks about the residual welfare model, which is typically a typical example of which is the United States, where the source of welfare is the family and the market. Then you have the German example per se, which is the industrial achievement performance model, which focuses on rewarding as per performance. And then thirdly, the most renowned model is the Nordic model, which is the institutional redistributive model as per Titmus, which talks about the principle of need over the principle of merit and talks about universal entitlements. Now, India, being a peculiar case, doesn't exactly fit into any of those three per se. So how do you view India in context of these three models, and what would you say is the path ahead for India if on these
Well, it's a good question because it's very disputed if it's relevant to use these models to describe countries such as India, the global south as is often referred to, less industrialized, lower middle income countries. These models were described, it's called Three Worlds, the book that it's referring to, but it's three worlds within the rich industrialized countries, the OECD countries. So it has clear limitations, and some people would argue that it can be adopted to study also the welfare development and the status in countries such as India. Ian Goff would argue that, and says that you then have to have much more an emphasis on the family, on community, on non-governmental organizations than the model usually do, because they're very models are quite state-centered and also kind of industrial male breadwinner models is one of the criticism against these models. I tend to think that that it can be applied with huge qualifications. It's interesting to look at India now as a country that's industrializing, and what we see is that in Europe certainly the expansion of welfare institutions was closely associated with industrialization, changing needs in the population. Just for example, the urbanization, the breakup of the care and responsibilities of the extended family when people move. Then you have a need for more institutional care, say for the elderly. Many people in countries such as India react to the way we have institutionalized that with old age homes and things like that. But what we see in an industrializing China, for example, is that there's a lot of hardship and isolation among the elderly who are left behind when the young move to the cities to work. So you have to adapt to that, and you are then also more exposed to market risks. I like to think of this as risk management, welfare state as risk management, that you have risks in life, and in a more modernized, industrialized societies, those change. When you are dependent on earned income from labor, rather than what you could get out of a piece of land, then you're also more vulnerable should that income fall away. So you have to have different kinds of insurances, protection against sickness, against unemployment, in case of reaching old age and not working anymore. You have to have systems of securing an income maintenance, securing either the standard of living or that you had, or a minimum standard of living, and that seems to be the case that countries that industrialize, whether they are communist like the Soviet Union or China, or social democratic like Norway, or more conservative like Germany, or more liberal like the UK and the US, they all have created new institutions of welfare as the countries have industrialized and modernized. So as India is clearly on the path towards industrialization, I think it's inevitable that new institutions will be created, and welfare will need to be expanded beyond the areas where you find welfare institutions, clearly also in this country. Similarly to my own country, those who were close to the king or close to power, state workers, often had welfare arrangements in the form of pensions and different securities long before the average general population. And that's what I understand is also the case with people working in the postal services of India, or in the world's largest employer I believe is the Indian Railway.
It is.
That they would have things in place, but that is understandable, and that's something we see in many countries. That's kind of a beginning, but that needs to be expanded to other groups as well. When you get this reliance on income from work, and the family structure is changing as a result of urbanization and industrialization.
It's interesting you spoke about industrialization, because industrial societies are also characterized by commodification of land, labor and money. And Esping Anderson has spoken about social interventions as a means to decommodify this process of commodification that is taking place, but that is more in context of the formal sector. How do you apply this theory, this decommodification index, to developing economies in the global south, which have which have a huge informal economy, prevalence of a huge informal economy?
Well, I think I'm no expert on India, that be clear, or other developing countries. My knowledge is mainly with the OECD countries, but I think you will find a shift towards a greater formalization of the labor market. I think that will be necessary as you have more regular workplaces established. I mean, you see that also in China, with their extremely rapid economic growth, that you have more of a formalization of work. I mean, the informal labor market is kind of I would almost say a pre-industrial form of organizing labor. It's something that certainly doesn't serve the worker, and I think it's for a society to develop, it also needs more control of, say, working conditions, and to have systems in place that protect labor, because when you if you talk about decommodification of, you know, the ability to opt out or not be suffering from being forced out of the labor market, that's kind of a long shot for the economy in India, but to have more protection where other forms of protection of the community and the family will be forced to play a smaller role. That needs to be put in place.
So when we consider social policies in the European context, for instance, so there is social stratification based on caste lines that we do not consider because it's very particular to India. So how do you see affirmative action policies in India and the politics of caste that goes behind it?
Well, caste it's a sad thing to see the prevalence of caste, because to me, in my understanding, it's kind of it belongs in an old feudal society, and in many ways there are feudal elements still left in China. According to a UN report, there's about 14 million farm laborers who live in slave conditions in the country. I mean, that has no place in a modern society. And I know that's something that's being addressed in this country now. So there are things that are hard to accommodate with the expressed ambitions of modernizing society, and to me it's almost shocking to see how such feudal structures are prevailing 70 years after the Constitution. But that also tells us that things that have existed for a long time become ingrained in kind of the culture of the country, and there's a lot of resistance to change. You can abolish the caste system, but you can't abolish the discrimination of people according to identities. I mean, your name tells, if you hear somebody's name, you place them already quite quickly. So it's those things are harder to combat. And I noticed that, you know, you have these quota systems of giving preferential treatments to discriminated groups, and that is it's probably necessary, but when the quota system gives people access to education and they get qualified, which happens a lot in India now, but when they then go out to compete for jobs, the same system is there stopping them, then that has almost, you know, given them a disservice that they are qualified, but the labor market is still closed according to caste lines, and that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the individual, but more structurally observed, it's a tragedy for the nation. It's a waste of talent, and that's something that strikes me is that India has so much talent, and then to create these kind of roadblocks for people's fulfillment of their aspirations, because we all have aspirations regardless of caste and background, and that is such a waste for society and for the economy at large. So I think that is I think that the functioning of divisions according to class and discrimination according to classes, to caste, is something that is going to be a great challenge to address when modernizing this country, and the country has to invest in its main human capital, which is people. Like you say, that Norway, my country, is very rich because now, compared to other countries, also because we have such great oil revenues. But economists have calculated that the value of the human capital of a highly skilled and educated population far surpasses the value of the oil that we have. So it's investing in your population through good education, most importantly, and not least the health services that are available, so that people can fulfill these aspirations, because there is so much talent and so many people who could help this country, help themselves and help this country develop, and I don't think any country can afford to waste such potential.
Back to your home country, Norway. Now, historically, Norway has been a very homogeneous country in terms of ethnicity, culture, language, and it has really worked for the Norwegian welfare state. However, the state is also facing these challenges on the front of, say, immigration, on the front of, reducing tax rates in the private sector, or in terms of an aging population. So, how do you see Norway confronting these disagreements over social policy?
Well, I don't know. There are elements of disagreement, and we see that in the political debate, and immigration is by many seen as kind of a threat to the political right will see that as a threat to the Norwegian welfare state. To some extent, I think it's very important to take that criticism seriously, because homogeneity and equality and a strong social capital in the form of trust, that people trust that others do the way you think you should do. That is a great asset, and if people start distrusting other people's objectives, whether they are right or wrong, that could be a problem. And if you then end up with large parts of the immigrant population failing to enter into the labor market, and therefore depending on welfare, that could undermine the support for the universal, rights-oriented and fairly generous welfare arrangements that we have. But on the other hand, Norway, together with most OECD countries, in contrast to India, is an aging society. So we stand a lot to benefit from a younger population of immigrants who are coming in, and we can, we haven't had the expenses of giving them the upbringing in many cases, and we can if they find a place in the labor market and become taxpayers, that's like the vast majority of people in Norway are, then that would be a partial solution to the problem where we are getting more and more to the situation where fewer workers support a larging old population.
The challenge here is to reconcile the immigrants and getting them to sort of integrate with the major population and treat them as an asset.
Yeah, and we talk about caste here, but we also have discrimination in Norway. There are people who have changed their name into something that sounds more Norwegian, so that their application will be looked at. So we don't have caste. We
we have discrimination according to ethnicity as well, and that's very serious. And again, if we discriminate in that way, we are doing ourselves a great disservice from not utilizing the talent, and also to create a kind of an immigrant underclass, which is not the case in Norway now, but that's something that could happen. And we've seen examples of that in other European countries, where you have more ghetto formations and with all the problems associated with that. So it's very important to give people the support they need to become active members of society.
So as we talk about discrimination, you've been involved very extensively with a project around the shame of poverty and the shame associated with being poor. Maybe you could tell us a little about the project.
Well, that's an interesting project, because usually research on poverty is very divided in two camps. One is looking at poverty in OECD countries, and I've been part of that. The other is looking at poverty in kind of a development perspective in poorer countries, and these two groups seldom talk together. So one part of our research is that we crossed that border. We involved researchers from China, India, Pakistan, South Korea, Norway, the UK, the US, in these projects. So we had to deal with this across in a global context, and we needed to do that because one objective of our research was to look at maybe even test a contention made by Amartya Sen, who says that regardless if we talk about the kind of poverty you see in India, that's often measured by the UN and the World Bank by kind of $1 or $1.50 a day, absolute poverty. When you look at that, and at the same time look at, say, in Norway, where we also talk about poverty, but relative poverty, which is relative to other people who are doing very well in general in our country, you would think that those two life situations of a poor person in India and the poor person in Norway is so different that there's nothing in common. But what we find in our research through interviews and focus groups and the study of novels and literature in India, we looked at the films as a cultural expressions. We find that the experience of the feeling of shame associated with the experience of being poor in relation to others in your community is very similar. And so it's that's kind of the social psychology of poverty that has, like much psychology, has strong impact on people's ability to function in society. Because if you feel guilt, you can act on it, you can rectify, do better. But if you feel shame, you want to be invisible. You want to hide, because it's not what you've done, but who you are that's attacked. And that can come from the inside, how you feel about yourself, but very often it's also imposed from how other people treat you. So it can be imposed by neighbors, but also by the welfare arrangements in the country that we very often see. And that is a very important insight that came out of this research, and found to be so important that it influenced the final drafting of the ILO recommendation on social protection floors. And based on our research, these 185 countries agreed to include a principle of when you introduce such social protection floors in all of these countries, you have to do it with respect to human dignity. And that is as important in the safety nets of Norway as it is in the implementation of the below poverty line policies of India.
Sir, thank you for joining the members of Lokniti for this interview, and we're really happy that you came and you gave us all the concepts of social policy and welfare, and you spent so much time in class, after class with us, and to share your experience of Norway, talk about your book. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, I thank you. I have learned so much from talking with you guys, and that's one thing that is so great about these exchanges, that we have been able to get finance from both your government and my government, that we can that we as both as teachers can come between our two countries, and also students can join in classes in the different countries. And I'm doing this because I love teaching, but also because I learned so much from the discussions, and we've had very good discussions over these days that we've had here. So I hope we can continue doing that. Thank you.